Great.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us here at the Centre for Policy Studies Fringe event at this year's virtual Conservative Party conference. My name is Eamon Ives. I'm a researcher here at the CPS, and I lead on all our energy and environmental policy work. I'm sure you'll all agree that the environment has really rocketed up the agenda, even as the COVID pandemic has been going on, and we've particularly seen that evidenced in all of the rhetoric around building back better, to use the lexicon of our Prime Minister. This morning's event is entitled The Nuclear Option, What is the Future for the UK Nuclear Industry? And I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of guests who I'm sure will be able to shed considerable light on that question. But before we begin, some quick housekeeping. This event is kindly sponsored by EDF Energy, so we're very thankful for their generosity for that, which helps us bring these events. We will also be having a Q&A at the end, so after our guests have made their opening statements, so do please get your questions in now. You can do that hopefully using the chat function here, or you can tweet us at CPS Think Tank, or you can tweet myself at Eamon Ives. Hopefully we'll pick those up and we can see what our guests think there. But yes, let's cut to the chase. Nuclear power, a way to generate energy which divides opinion, to say the least. To its proponents, it's a high-tech, low-carbon, reliable power source. To its detractors, it's expensive, outdated, potentially dangerous technology. But what are the facts of the matter? Will it help us get to net zero? Should we be installing more capacity? And how should the government interact with this industry? So I'm going to start by bringing in the Right Honourable Kwarteng MP, who is the Minister for Clean Growth in the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and so someone who I'm sure is better placed than most in the country to help answer some of those questions. So over to you, Minister.
So, Eamon, I think you're quite right to say that it is quite controversial, but I think the reasons why it is controversial in terms of nuclear power aren't that applicable to the UK. I think we've had a very successful nuclear industry over decades, and in the 50s and 60s we were in fact pioneers. We were at the cutting edge of this technology, and it so happens that most of our existing fleet is now coming to the end of its useful life, and we have to make a decision, I think, to invest in more as a country. I'm not just talking about government investment, but we've got EDF here who also deploy their own capital. But we've got to invest as a country, I think, in more nuclear power. And I think there will be a commitment. I mean, the white paper we're still waiting for, and I hope that it'll come out soon. The Secretary of State said it would come out this autumn, and I think that means probably next month. But in that, I think there is a broad commitment to more nuclear power. And for the reasons that you've said, if we're serious about net zero and decarbonising sources of power, if you like, decarbonisation, nuclear does answer that need. It doesn't involve the burning, obviously, of fossil fuels. It's clean. It's also firm power, which for people who don't know is it's not renewable. So you've got two aspects. You've got dispatchable power, which is constant, and then you've got the renewables aspect, which obviously is a direct, or the amount of renewable energy you can produce is a direct function of winds blowing and the sun shining and all of that, and that can be variable. Whereas nuclear power is a constant, and if we want dispatchable power, firm power, as some people call it, which is decarbonized, nuclear power does answer that question. Now, in terms of the controversy, I think a lot of it is to do with things that have happened in the past. So one of the things that we've learned in the last month is that Hitachi, which is a Japanese company, has pulled out essentially of Wilfer. And actually, that came on my desk. I've looked at that. We've talked about it. But the main thing there was that the Japanese obviously had Fukushima, I think, in 2011. And that really, I think, has changed their appetite and also their investors' appetite for nuclear. As a consequence of Fukushima, I think Angela Merkel, perhaps prematurely, who knows, but she essentially shifted the policy the German policy on nuclear on the back of that. And Germany no longer is deploying nuclear power, which I think is probably a shame for them, because their coal phase out will only happen in 2038. I mean, that's a long time, 2038. It's 18 years. And they're more dependent on coal for longer. That would be completely unacceptable in this country. There's no way that a government could say, well, you know, we're going to abandon nuclear, but we're going to burn coal until 2038. So as far as the UK is concerned, I think nuclear is a strong option. People will talk about small modular reactors, which are sort of basically a kind of curtailed and mini version of the gigascale technology. But I think there is a commitment across all of government for more nuclear power. But there is a debate about obviously where the settings are, what projects we're going to use or deploy. But I don't think there's a question in government about the desirability of this technology. We've got huge skills. We've got a national college which is based out near Hinkley Point in Somerset. We've got huge investment. We've got skills. We've got apprenticeships. We've got jobs in the industry, and I think that you'll see that the government remains committed to it.
Fantastic. Lots and lots to dig into there. So I'll now turn to our second parliamentarian on our panel. That's the Right Honourable Philip Dunn, MP. Philip's the chair of the Environmental Audit Select Committee, so is certainly qualified to weigh in on some of the questions involved in this nuclear debate, not least from the environmental perspective, but also the economic one as well. So Philip, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eamon. I'd just like to start by saying my committee has not considered the subject of nuclear energy or the contribution it would make to the energy mix in recent times, and therefore I'm speaking as an individual rather than for the committee, just to be straightforward about that. So I have experience of the nuclear industry primarily from my time as a defence minister, where I was in charge of procurement, including the renewal of the fleet, the maintenance support to the existing nuclear fleet there. And one of the things that was crystal clear to me during that time, which was between 2012 and 2016, was the need, if we are to get back into the business of civil generation through the nuclear fleet and the repurposing of existing sites as they get shut, existing reactors get shut down, we have to maintain a skill base in this country which can ensure that we can continue to deploy nuclear capacity in the civil sector in a safe, reliable and timely way. And my main challenge, I think, for the Minister, and what I was very relieved to hear him say just now, was that it retains a strong government commitment to the nuclear sector, and that there is going to be a policy paper coming up very shortly. I think that is utterly essential, because the thing that the industry lacks at the moment is certainty. Speaking from my opinion, that within my committee in the environmental movement, as has been rightly said by Kwasi, this is a polarizing issue. It's not one where there is the same degree of consensus across the environmental movement. In fact, there's probably more hostility to it than acceptance. So it needs to be handled centrally. But there is no doubt that the country is going to require more electricity generation as we move away from fossil fuel generation. The capacity for that to come from renewables grows all the time as renewable technologies improve, but there is undoubtedly a period of some decades where renewables will not be able to provide the baseload 24/7 energy requirements until we've got an ability to store energy in the way that we don't at present. We're going to have a requirement for baseload capacity generation, and nuclear at the moment is the least damaging to the environment means of doing so. At least that's my contention. So I personally am a supporter of replacing our existing nuclear fleets. And I think we've heard there's about 20% of capacity comes from the fleets which are now in the process, or will be in the process of decommissioning over the next decade or so. We have to make a decision as a government during this immediate period to proceed with replacing those fleets. We've obviously got the Sizewell issue is the sort of next one in line with Hinkley Point under construction. And I would urge the Minister to ensure that during his time in post, he's able to preside over a decision that we can proceed with the next in line and set the path and the policy framework to allow a continued nuclear industry in the civil sector in this country, so that we can make sure that we've got the power that we need and the increasing amount of power that we need over the coming decades. I think the issue is in part around supply, and it's in part, as I've touched on already, around skills. And there's no question that we have, having made a decision to get back into nuclear since the last plant was commissioned, I think, in the mid-90s, 1995, I think. There has been a dearth of skills which requires rebuilding over a consistent period. We need some of the brightest and the best to go into this sector of our engineering graduates each year. If they have no sense that there is going to be an enduring career, then we risk effectively exporting the technology and the capacity to maintain that technology abroad would be an enormous missed opportunity. So my simple message really for the Minister on this panel is you've got an opportunity to set the future of energy policy on your watch. Please do it.
Sure, thank you.
There's the instruction to the Minister. Thank you, Philip. Lots to dig into in the discussion afterwards there. So I will now turn to Tanisha Bibi, who is the Senior Policy Advisor at the CBI, a powerhouse on all things decarbonisation, not just nuclear, but other technologies as well, which I think I'd quite like to explore going forwards. So yes, over to you, Tanisha.
Thanks, Eamon. And just to first of all say that I completely agree with everything that's been said already, so I won't repeat the key points, and definitely keen to get into the discussion and the specifics of all those issues. But for me, to put everything into a bit of context, the business community, the private sector, is continuing to battle with COVID-19, and there are many businesses who very much are still struggling. Some are benefiting and developing themselves quite well out of it, but ultimately, across the private sector, challenges remain. Across the last few months, a lot of our members have very much reiterated their commitment to net zero and have very much shown continuous and unwavering support for our long-term climate targets, which I think is something to remind the audience that are listening. Climate change is still very much a business priority. And from our point of view, there's quite a few lessons that we can learn from COVID-19 that we can apply to tackling the climate crisis. But at the moment, the aim really is to figure out how we recover from COVID-19. How do we recover in a sustainable and resilient way? And from our point of view, at the centre of that question and the net zero challenge is our low carbon energy system. And ultimately, yes, we believe that nuclear is a key part of that energy mix and that energy system. There are other technologies, there are other solutions and alternative ways of enabling the energy transition, and I'm very keen that we'll get into those kind of alternative technologies in the discussion. But ultimately, yes, nuclear is part of the solution, and from a business point of view, something that we're constantly calling for, and I'm sure those on the call will resonate with this, is the power that policy has to enable investment in these technologies. And the fact that businesses are constantly grappling with political situations, whether it's kind of economic recession or COVID-19 or the threat of nationalisation or whatever it is, businesses need as much certainty as possible to enable the masses of capital that frankly are there to be spent right now. There's money to be spent in the private sector. We just need government policy to enable the environment to bring that investment forward to the UK. And we know what policy is needed, and we are very keen to kind of work with the government to make sure that policy is delivered on over the next decade, especially.
Thank you, Tanisha. Really interesting, not least from the sort of financial side, obviously of huge importance, about the great scale of capex costs involved in some of these projects in renewables and, of course, nuclear. I'll just take a moment to say that we have had lots of questions coming in, but do please keep submitting them. You can do that on the chat or on Twitter. And now I shall turn to Simone, our final speaker. So Simone, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to go last, so that almost all my points have been made already, particularly by Kwasi. Thank you very much, and everyone else. So I will go straight maybe to the point to say that maybe one thought on nuclear. Sometimes we hear an opposition between nuclear and renewables. That is a false argument. As far as EDF is concerned, we strongly believe that we should put into the system as much renewables as we possibly can. I listened to the speech of the Prime Minister to the UN Climate Week when he said the UK is the Saudi Arabia of wind, and I completely agree with that. The point is that, as we know, for the time being, it is important to have a complementary solution to the renewables for the gaps that are not covered by the renewables. And nuclear has one feature, if I may say so, that is interesting, which is it works, it's proven, and it's available now. It's true future technologies might evolve over decades. I completely agree with Philip that over time might, offer alternatives. But for a solution which is deployable now, I think it's really important to consider. So I will go straight into why we are so confident to propose to government the Sizewell C project. Our confidence resides first in the fact that we are working on Hinkley Point C, where we're actually building this technology. I have to say that we are happy with where we are with this project. These projects are complex, so we shouldn't underestimate. We need to remain humble, but we have put in place a number of measures which come from previous projects elsewhere in the world, and these measures are working as expected. We are exploiting some innovations in the construction methods that we think will help us. In Hinkley, we are building two twin units, shifted 12 months one from the other. And what we are seeing is that on the second unit, actually we observe better productivity than the first unit, between 20 and 30% faster, which clearly encourages us to think about Sizewell C as the next project. It could be units 3 and 4 of Hinkley Point, because the secret recipe of Sizewell C is that it is a replica. It's a replica. So that's the best way we can do in nuclear to bring the project risks and costs under control, is to know exactly in detail what we are going to build the moment we start, which is the unique position that we can be in at the Sizewell C project if we do decide to go ahead. The second thing is that we can see in Hinkley Point the benefits that these type of projects can do to the economy in general. We've got over 2,000 British firms, large and small, up and down the country, and we've got this massive job creation in engineering, construction, manufacturing. These jobs are not just in Westminster or in some of the places where, they are really up and down the country. And I think in the leveling up agenda, which is on top of the manifesto for the government, it could be very helpful. So in Sizewell C, we think we have the design. We know what we will be building. We have a supply chain and an industry which is revving up in delivering Hinkley Point. So what we need is actually now a funding model, because we believe that the way that Hinkley was financed was, let me say, the only possibility at that point in time for a first-of-a-kind type of technology, albeit a very expensive way to finance a project. We think there are better answers that make the project more affordable to final consumers, and therefore we are very keen and I would say optimistic after listening to Kwasi, etc., that government will support the definition of a framework which makes the project possible. We think the time for a decision is now. Of course, we are in the middle of a pandemic, etc., so we all know how important it is to support the economy with jobs. We think that having a project ready to start is an unmissable opportunity, and we should just go for it. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Simone. In fact, I'm going to pick up pretty much where you left off in this sort of discussion part. You've asked for a framework of financing. One of those would be the regulated asset-based model. I wonder if, Kwasi, you'd be able to comment a little bit on that. Obviously, we've got the white paper coming, so I don't want you to necessarily preempt anything which might be coming down the line, but yes.
Look, I think it's common knowledge that when you're looking at nuclear, you are looking at a considerable capital expenditure from the get-go at the start. And so everyone knows that there's a wide debate as to how that money is raised and to what extent a government should be involved in that. Now, the return on asset model was something that we've looked at a lot. And one of the things that recommended it in the first instance was the fact that, or the belief rather, that it would not be treated as on balance sheet government liability, as it were. Okay, so one of the reasons that people liked it was that in terms of the international scoring, and if you're looking at international national indebtedness and national debt, there was a feeling that the return on asset model somehow was a carve out from that. Now, my understanding is that has shifted. And that it will be looked at or scored as government liability, government debt, and on that basis, the Treasury are looking at it. I think the way in which the Treasury looks at these things as well is to think, why shouldn't we have upside? So why shouldn't we have equity, a portion of equity from the government essentially being invested in this deployment? So all of these financial questions are really important, and it would be unrealistic of me to say that all those questions have been resolved. I think there is a broad strategic commitment, but the way in which and how the way the finance is arrived at and the way it's characterized or categorized are further questions for further debate.
Excellent, thank you. Simone, I don't know whether you want to sort of comment on that. I mean, there are questions about the RUB, and I think often quite legitimate, and I don't think anyone pretends it's sort of a perfect model. One of the things that people are quite worried about is the fact that costs could overrun. They have overrun on nuclear projects. Nobody's denying that. But you kind of hinted in your opening remark that sort of Sizewell could demonstrate those cost reductions and learning by doing, which has happened on Hinkley, particularly as you've shifted onto the second unit. You think that could be replicated, and that kind of makes the RUB a less sort of risky model to go forward with?
Yes, it does, very much so. I have to say, just to be clear, we shouldn't be naive and imagine that these projects will become easy and no problems, etc. These are large, massive infrastructure projects. However, the real difference between the Sizewell C project and any of the other new nuclear projects scattered around the world which are causing some sort of headaches is that you would have already the design the moment you start. It's hard to believe, but when you consider, even in Hinkley Point at the time of starting, we did not have a detailed design for an entire power station. And we still do not have. We have a detailed design up to a certain level, and the engineering is moving, ahead of the construction. But, it's not until literally, maybe in 1.5 years from today that we will have a full comprehensive detailed design, because the amount of engineering is so massive that you can't do it before you actually start. So the possibility of building a twin power station is a unique opportunity to reduce the level of risk. There remains a level of risk which I would characterize as normal to a very large infrastructure. So you could still have, unpredictable events or quality events, etc. Although we believe that the amount of uncertainty is reduced. Where the role of the government comes into the picture is that, there was a doctrine in the past, maybe to which also Kwasi partially referred to, where these initiatives should be entirely financed by the private markets. But, this is a very large national infrastructure. it's not far from being, you know, kind of a new high-speed railway or a new, you know, airport. You know, these are major pieces of infrastructure, strategic decisions. So I would say it's not unknown that countries put their strength, their balance sheet, their credibility into these initiatives. Now, of course, probably there is a place to consider a joint effort where some private capital, the industrial developer, government, you know, they all play a role. Maybe there is a place where this can come together. But I think it shouldn't be a scandal to anybody to say, well, government is, you know, supporting this particular technology. This is a very major industrial infrastructure, and I think it makes sense to deliver it in better conditions and also eventually cheaper for consumers.
Great, fantastic. I'm keen to sort of pivot ever so slightly now onto something which Philip raised, which was that we are, as we necessarily decarbonize to get to 2050, we are going to need to start producing a lot more electricity, and pretty much all of it's going to need to be low carbon, zero carbon. That's to sort of satisfy things with the wider electrification of the economy as we all sort of go towards electric vehicles or heat pumps, or maybe to produce sort of renewable hydrogen that we can put into heating and industrial processes and transport applications. So Philip, I wonder whether you can kind of comment on that. You said that sort of we are going to need renewables to do a lot more, but that they're maybe not quite at the standard we need them to be, particularly in terms of sort of covering particularly low parts where there's not much storage in the system. Do you have any thoughts on kind of when that might be, and when we can start to rely on renewables to really produce the lion's share of our electricity needs?
Well, our committee took evidence on the offshore wind sector. In fact, the Minister was kind enough to come and talk to us about that. And it's very clear that there is the potential to increase the amount of electricity generated from offshore wind exponentially. The government has set a target to get from 10 gigawatts to 4 gigawatts. Industry think it can almost double that within a reasonable time frame, but we're talking sort of 2030 to get to 40 gigawatts potentially, and it could be a little bit, it'll take longer to the 75 that the industry think is possible. Hydrogen, we're all looking forward eagerly to publication of a hydrogen strategy, which the government hinted is likely, but hasn't told us when that's going to be. It may or may not be affected by the delay in the budget, and the Minister might be able to give us insight into that. But right now, it seems that inconceivable that we will be able to generate the kind of base load energy generation that we require for the next 2 decades without using nuclear capacity. So I don't think there's that much of a choice unless we want to, if we're going to head for net zero Britain, which we're fully determined to do. I think it's hard to see how renewables can achieve that, particularly at times of day and times of meteorological conditions when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, unless we're going to use nuclear capacity to do that.
Great, thank you. So Tanisha, I'm going to come to you now. You said that there's still an overwhelming appetite from sort of private sector and business to embed climate change and net zero into their work going forward as we sort of hopefully emerge from this COVID-19 crisis. You've also said there's sort of money to be spent, to be deployed, but you kind of I think you said you needed the policy to be there. We've got the Minister here right now. What do you, if there's kind of one policy or maybe a couple of policies which you sort of most like to see, maybe particularly in terms of to help nuclear power and other low carbon energy sources get onto the grid, what would you have to say there?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be able to choose just one technology. That wouldn't be fair to all my members. But the main kind of requirements that I guess you could say that businesses need isn't just in the policy decision making themselves, and I can talk about that in a minute, but it's the governance as well of the policy frameworks and the way in which they're set and the way in which they are, reviewed and make sure they're fit for purpose and that they're long term and inclusive and fair and all these things. The governance of the policy that we need is really important and critical. But for me, I think on the nuclear side, we've already discussed RAB. It's very financially based. It's very much the decision that needs to be made on that particular decision is frankly immediate. It needs to happen as soon as possible. You know, we have somebody saying that already, and we definitely agree with that. But I think there is something to be said for the other technologies that are needed as part of the energy mix. And, you know, we can take learnings, as Philip kind of said already, especially from the renewables sector. So if we look at wind, you have the CFD, which has performed really well. We know that mechanism works fantastically well for that technology. And there is a lot of analysis being done now to look at whether we can take learnings from that policy and implement it elsewhere. So if you take the CFD, you can actually develop it slightly and tweak it and improve it, frankly, to enable hydrogen to come forward. You can do it for CCS when CCS or carbon capture and storage, is built. And that type of analysis is ongoing. We've had consultations with the government already around business models for those technologies. But you know, those decisions that need to be made, those policy decisions, and this goes back to the governance point, need to be made in the next few years. This isn't something that we can put back and back and back to 2030 and 2040 and leave it for someone else to do. These policy decisions that enable investments come forward, like CFDs or like RAB and other models, if you like, they need to be developed, introduced within the next couple of years. And that's something that we're continuously pushing for. And it's why, you know, when you have strategies like the Energy White Paper, the hydrogen strategy, the forthcoming industrial decarbonisation strategy, the Treasury's review of costs of net zero, all these documents that industry are just waiting to be published. You know, we need them to be published. Everyone knows that. I think the main kind of line that I would say from the business community is, if you're going to commit to publishing the strategy, publish it, and try and, you know, these things, the energy sector and the policy decisions that we need to make, like I said, need to happen soon, and those strategies need to be published when they're promised to being published. And that is what will enable that capital investment to come forward in all these different technologies.
Thank you very much. So I'm now going to move over to some of the questions which we've had coming in. I'm going to pick one up here from Kate, who says that one of the major benefits that nuclear has over sort of solar and wind is land usage. I think we've also touched upon how it has kind of other benefits, maybe in sort of defense applications and things like that. In a way, I think nuclear is kind of, it can do a lot more than sort of other forms of electricity production. And does that kind of, maybe to Kwasi here, does that kind of change how government thinks about it, in that you can't necessarily sort of compare it like for like with, say, an offshore wind turbine or a solar panel, in that it could sort of provide other uses, and therefore it's a bit more of a difficult question when you're kind of comparing them?
Yeah, look, I mean, you know, we're all in a kind of harmony of agreement here in terms of the special qualities that the nuclear industry, nuclear power gives. I mean, in no particular order, but summarily. Firstly, you've got the base load that Philip referred to, firm power, dispatchable power, whatever you want to call it, but it's consistent and isn't dependent on the vagaries of the weather or the sun shining or the wind blowing or anything like that. So that's a massively attractive thing. The other thing that Philip mentioned that I didn't mention, drawing on his experience, is in defence. So the kinds of skills that you would need in the military defence space can be honed and developed in the civil nuclear space. And there's clearly a synergy between the two, which means that nuclear power, I think, is attractive on those grounds. Thirdly, I think just to develop the skills, you know, there's a huge potential in nuclear power to develop smaller modular reactors, small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors. It's an evolving technology, and for us to turn our backs on that, I think is a very big call, because, you know, clearly there's a lot of innovation in the nuclear space. So for all these reasons, and there are jobs, there are supply chain impacts, I think there is a commitment on the part of government to maintain a high degree of nuclear power. As Philip said, or I think Simone, it's 20% of our generating power now. We'll need a lot more electricity generation. So it would seem odd to turn our back on nuclear when we need more electricity and more decarbonised electricity. Having said that, there are issues about funding which are still being debated, and that's part of an ongoing conversation. Just on an earlier point that was raised just now, I think it's absolutely right that these strategies are vital. We're dependent on the energy white paper. It would be literally preposterous to have a hydrogen strategy before we publish the energy white paper. But once the energy white paper is published, there's a whole host of work that myself and officials are engaged in, trying to look at hydrogen, looking at decarbonised industry, also looking at heat and buildings, which is not really a subject for this morning, but that's a key aspect in decarbonisation. So there's, these papers are really, really important because, as has been said, industry needs clear indicative direction from government, and these papers provide that in many instances.
Great, yeah. Simone, I don't know whether you kind of want to pick up on that. Is that I've been sort of talking to people in the sort of nuclear energy space for the last couple of months, and one of the things that sort of the most pro-nuclear people are actually quite keen to promote is the fact that it sort of can be used in other things. And Kwasi, you say we weren't going to touch on heat, but actually I will, because I think one thing which I think you want to maybe look at doing in Sizewell C is to see how you can capture some of the waste heat from those reactors if they were built to sort of help decarbonise domestic heating. Obviously, we touched on how it could be used to produce green hydrogen, which will be necessary in the future economy. So is that something which kind of comes into your thinking when you're trying to maybe persuade government to sort of get behind nuclear a bit more? Are you kind of trying to play up those other benefits beyond purely providing sort of reliable low carbon electricity?
Yeah, look, very much so. I'd like to maybe expand on that, but also comment on on one of the drawbacks of nuclear, because I think it's important that we maintain a balance and we consider all the aspects. So, the decarbonizing power with renewables, it goes straight from the wind or the sun into electricity. When you do with nuclear, actually you go through heat, and then heat gets turned into electricity. Now, this is a choice that has been made historically to use all the heat to produce electricity. And some of the heat actually goes through the cooling system into the sea. So now, as we are now thinking about net zero, we say, hold on a minute, for net zero, we might need a whole lot of hydrogen, potentially. So how do you produce it? So one way is to produce it through the electrolysis at, ambient temperature. But another way is also to use electrolysis at high temperature, which is more efficient. So, a lot next to a nuclear station, you could have loads literally of low carbon heat, which is produced as a result of the nuclear station running, as well as the electricity. So you could combine the two to bring to effectiveness a more effective version of hydrolysis. Alternatively, we are thinking about direct air capture to say, wouldn't it be good to be able to extract CO2 from the atmosphere and store it somewhere? We know that the UK has unrivaled resources of depleted fields, which were used to for oil production. So we could, couple them for carbon storage. But how to capture the carbon? To have a direct air capture system, you need heat. Once again, alongside a nuclear station, you have low carbon heat. You can use it. So you see, so we need to open up our mind to be able to, derive some of the heat. And maybe there will be a moment, as Philip alluded to, there will be an explosion of offshore wind. At some point, in windy days, we will have more than enough electricity than what we need. So during those times, for example, we could, flip the switch and use the low carbon heat to produce hydrogen or to do direct air capture or other things. Or vice versa, produce electricity will actually need it and there's no wind, etc. So this entire world of possibilities is out there. I want to touch, however, also on some of the drawbacks, because otherwise people listen to me and say, nuclear is perfect. It is not perfect. Nuclear, when you produce with nuclear power, you do produce an element of waste. It's the spent fuel. The fuel which has been used can no longer be used. And it's radioactive. So what do we do with the waste fuel? I think it's important that we understand it. I went myself to the storage of fuel from the Sizewell B power station. and 60 years worth of production will fit into a warehouse. So just to say, think about the volume of this. A fossil fuel station, gas or coal, dumps, thousands of tons of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is therefore, a dump for everything. And as a result, the planet is cooking. So whereas in nuclear, we take responsibility for this waste. It's very, very small in volumes. You can literally 60 years of production into a warehouse. And after a few years in the spent pool, you can actually touch it. I went inside myself, you can touch it. It's completely passive. It doesn't need any sophisticated forms of maintenance. It does not explode. It does not leak, nothing. The only thing, it will last for a long time. But I have to say, it's important that we have also these arguments, and I would welcome anybody on the call, etc., if you want to understand more. Maybe also to come and visit, because once you see for yourself, you can understand. So there are some drawbacks. Of course, it would be ideal. There's no such thing as a perfect recipe, isn't there? So every source of energy has its own features, so advantages and some drawbacks. So I just wanted to make it clear to everybody that this is also an important aspect not to be forgotten.
No, I'm glad you did that, because we've actually had a question come in precisely on the fact about nuclear waste, and could we strictly regard it as clean if it is producing waste? But yeah, I think it's remarkable if anyone sort of goes away and does their research, just how little waste has been produced, and obviously it needs to be dealt with and dealt with sensitively. But it is quite staggering just how small amounts are produced, particularly for the energy that you get on the other side as well. So the title of this event is The Future of Nuclear. So I think it would be remiss not to talk about some of those potential future technologies, and maybe I can bring in Tanisha here. SMRs, nuclear fusion, advanced reactors, where do you sort of come down on that? Do you have anything to sort of say? And maybe your members, are they kind of investing in these types of things? Are they going to be what sort of gets nuclear down cost competitive on a sort of levelized cost of energy basis with renewables?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's important that we address the fact that nuclear power isn't just big power stations. It's not just the big Hinckleys and the big Sizewells and other stations. There's a huge role from the CPI's point of view and from our members' point of view for small modular reactors in particular. That technology is developing quite well. We see it as being a much more kind of efficient, cost-effective way of deploying nuclear power. We know actually kind of the steps that need to be taken to enable SMRs to be scaled up in the country. We know that businesses are seeking to work with the government for on the delivery of a national policy statement around a program that enables SMRs, and that's looking at things like siting and licensing proposals and so on. So the development of smaller modular reactors is very much developing, and that's a viable technology that we think could definitely be part of our future energy mix. I think for fission and fusion, it's a little bit more complicated. I think those technologies need a little bit more, a lot more kind of trialing, a lot more proof in the pudding, and a lot more detail around the viability of those technologies. I think it's fantastic that we have expertise in this country. We have centres of excellence, we have universities that are second to none and are doing some fantastic work on fission and fusion and on other technologies like direct air capture, for example. But that's, I think, something that the focus needs to be very much on the technologies that we know work, that we know can be potentially scaled up in the UK. And there's a lot more decision making that needs to be done on those technologies rather than focusing on, all our attention on future technologies in that sense. There's a lot more need for decision making now on technology we know works. And as I've said, new nuclear power, SMRs especially, we think are definitely part of that mix. But we're excited to see what kind of future technologies come forward and the cost curve of those technologies.
Absolutely, and I'm sure sort of the government's recent, I suppose it's always been ongoing, but particularly recent uplift in things like R&D and public R&D spending will no doubt help in hopefully commercializing some of those really exciting technologies so that they can be sort of feeding into the grid one day. I will now go to a question from Rachel Freeman, who says, The rate of the build of nuclear plants has been much slower than the rate that we need to build out new low carbon supplies to meet net zero. Can the build rate be speeded up? Maybe Kwasi or Simone, do you want to come in on there?
I think I'll leave it to Simone. I mean, my job is as the energy minister. He's actually tasked with building the plant, so I think he'd be better placed to answer that question.
So the answer is yes, I think. Actually, it would be a pity not to try and do so. As I said, so Sizewell presents an immediate opportunity, and thereafter it is possible to consider further projects, either of a gigawatt scale or maybe of the nature that we were talking about, such as SMRs, for example, if those technologies were to mature, to become implementable. I think all these options should be explored, and it's a strategic choice for the country. I think the country has the opportunity to continue to remain in control in this strategic technology. I think it will be interesting on a worldwide scale too. Kwasi alluded to the fact that, for example, Germany maybe decided in a bit of a too early way to opt out of nuclear. But we've seen other countries recently, such as the Netherlands or Poland or other countries in Europe, but also, of course, outside of Europe, really considering the role that technology can have. There is another feature, which is sovereignty, ability to really have the control on its own supply of energy, which is very attractive to a number of countries. So I think in terms of export potential of skills, of British skills, it shouldn't be disregarded. I think it's a technology that will have a role, not in every country, but in many countries, and maybe more countries than we currently think, because the net zero thing and the climate emergency is real. It's a slow burning COVID type of thing. But as nuclear clearly is a solution to this problem, I think it is important that as a country embraces this strategy. And it's like cycling. Once you begin to pedal, you shouldn't stop, because otherwise you fall. So I think we should continue to pedal and to exercise ourselves using some of the sites that are available in the UK. Some of the sites are actually excellent sites. And it's a pity that Hitachi pulled out of Wilfer, because the Wilfer is another excellent site where this technology can be deployed.
I like that metaphor a lot, actually. So a question here, which I wonder if Philip might be able to sort of weigh in on. Are there kind of any other opportunities on the horizon within the kind of energy space which will help us get to net zero? I think none of us on this call would imagine that we can build nuclear and then we've solved the problem. Are there any things, and I'm particularly thinking maybe around sort of demand side management, the idea that the cheapest megawatt is the one that you don't have to produce. Are there anything that your committee has seen which you're sort of particularly excited about?
Well, on the sort of interim path to net zero and renewable, we think there will be scope for carbon capture and usage and storage, some waste to energy technologies. We've not touched on tidal or wave power, where again the technologies are less well developed, but that's a persistent source. I've personally always been quite interested in the fact that Germany achieves about 10% of its energy generation from hydroelectric within the main river networks with submersible weirs on the Rhine and the Ruhr. We haven't done that on the Severn or the Thames, and I think that's something that we need to be at. I think there are some other technologies, but they're all at an early stage, and they're not going to jump in within the sort of time frame, I suspect, that we're talking about here. Can I just go back to one of the questions that you asked about land use? Actually, one of the unusual features of where we are in nuclear today compared to the first generation of nuclear fleets was that we've gone through the intense debate pressures with local communities to locate nuclear reactors on the civil side on specific sites, which have come to be an accepted part of the local economy as communities. And what we're talking about in the renewal is replacing existing reactors with new ones on the same sites or adjacent to the same sites. And therefore, the whole political battles that took place around those sites when going through the planning process and the commissioning process is going to be vastly reduced. And therefore, from a land use point of view, we are not talking on the current replacement models with the kinds of political battles and the delays that inevitably cause from contentious planning issues. That's one issue that I have in relation to the small modular reactors, which was touched on earlier, is that depending on where they go, if they were to go on new sites, you've got the planning challenge of acceptance with the local community, which you don't have if they were to be located on existing sites. I think that's a very important aspect of the delivery of this program in the UK.
Yeah, I think that's very, very apt point. I mean, if lots of people kick off at the idea that a house could be built next to them, I don't think there's going to be much less opposition to a small nuclear reactor being built, but definitely sort of a question to be had another time. We've had a few questions in, all sort of hinting at the same thing, which maybe, Kwasi, you could pick up on. This is Conservative government. What role does the government have in sort of supporting nuclear, and is it not sort of incumbent on us, as sort of historically the party of free markets, to sort of get out of the energy space and let markets work? How do you kind of square that question?
I think that the one of the features of energy policy over the last 100 years, it's been very much a dialogue, a collaboration between government and the private sector. Clearly, in energy markets, more than most other markets, there has to be a very strong regulatory framework. And the regulatory framework has to come from government. Now, and that's what we've been doing. So if you look at the deployment of offshore wind, it's not the government that's building these offshore wind stations. What the government's doing is setting an auction process. In some cases, it's underwriting that process. But ultimately, it's private capital and private initiative and businesses that deliver on offshore wind capacity. And in that instance, people go on about it, but it's very important to remember that this has been a huge success in the last 10 years. You know, of the global capacity, which is about 30 gigawatts, we have 10. So we have about a third, if not more, of global capacity. And that was a classic instance of government working with the private sector. It's the private sector that have invested in offshore wind and have actually delivered, but it's the government that set the parameters. Because when you're looking at innovation and technology, which requires a large degree of capital expenditure, you know, the Adam Smith world of just simply allowing the market to take its place or take its course would deliver these things in a much, much longer time frame. I've no doubt that in the end, you know, over decades and maybe centuries, the private sector would probably deliver a lot of this power, but we don't have all that time. And especially when you're talking about decarbonisation, that needs a very strong regulatory input. And you know, since the 19th century, government has been regulating the market. You know, we can't put 10-year-olds in chimneys and 10-year-olds in factories for 20 hours a day. And if you look at those arguments, that's exactly what people were saying in the 1840s. You know, the Factory Act, people were saying, well, you're interfering in the market, you know. So there's always a measure of regulation and as there has been for 200 years. And I think energy is a classic case where there is a dialogue required between government and the private sector.
Great, fantastic. We've got a couple minutes, so only very short left. Simone, I'm going to go back once more to you. We've had a question, if I can find it again. Is there a question about sort of how the health and safety frameworks interact with the sort of current policy? I think I've heard definitely in the past a lot of people saying that these were constructed in sort of the mid 20th century. Are they still sort of fit for purpose in the 21st? Could we kind of, obviously very sensitively given the issue at hand, but could we look at maybe seeing how those could be adapted for the 21st century, and would that make it easier for sort of nuclear power to be brought online?
You were referring to what specifically in your question?
Sort of the health and safety regulations around nuclear. Are they kind of too strict, and are they kind of badged in the old world of sort of Magnox reactors and things like that?
No, I don't think so. So, I mean, it's true that in the UK we have the ONR, which is the safety authority, which is highly reputable. The licensing conditions are very demanding, and I think rightfully so. You know, as Kwasi alluded to, it's essential that the country maintains an absolute standard and reputation in nuclear safety. This has to be the priority. So I think that the regulations are not at all, inappropriate, and they are rightfully demanding. And it clearly is a challenge to conform to these regulations and to those expectations. I think is the best thing we can do on behalf of the public.
Excellent, very short and well in time for our finish. So unfortunately, to those of you who also submitted questions, we are not going to be able to do them, but hopefully do keep sort of interacting with the CPS. You can do that. You can subscribe to our newsletter on our website. You can also do that for our media organization, CapEx. Follow us on Twitter. You can do that at CPS Think Tank. You can follow me if you would like to at Eamon Ives. Thank you for all our guests for joining and providing your comments. Thank you for EDF, particularly for helping us put this on. We have another event later on this afternoon, which will be looking at the role of hydrogen, which we've obviously touched upon. And do please sign in for that as well. But yes, once again, thank you all for watching, and thank you for my panelists.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.